Hi guys, it's me, the person speaking into the video, and the video is playing, presumably with the volume on, which is why you can hear me speaking. It has been about over a year since we got the release of Ekko skills, and I was going to make this video assuming that the last Book 8 New Heroes banner was going to have an Ekko skill on it. Had two rearms instead because I wanted to go over all the Ekkos that we had. You know, one of those fun a year later type videos that people like to do, including me, which is why I'm making this type of video. And that's what we're planning to do. We had the release of 9 Ekko skills between the periods of October of 2023 and October of 2024 because we did not get one this month. And I'll be ranking them one by one, starting from their release order. So, yeah, let's talk about why Deathblow Ekko is actually pretty cool. Okay, we won't start with that one yet because Attack Oath Ekko also released on the banner, and since Peony is on the leftmost side, I figured we start with that. Attack Oath Ekko was definitely one of the first Ekkos for sure, and it definitely screams one of the first Ekkos because it came out and I don't think it was particularly amazing to begin with. It wasn't bad by any means. Getting free Oath Warping and attack buffs is always pretty nice for the most part. People definitely liked using it during the time where Prime was actually a really good A slot, so it was just one extra bonus for the check to be made. And it was still a nice convenience for any support to get moving around, including dancers or even guidance bots. It definitely wasn't bad by any means, but it definitely wasn't something that was crazy good in my opinion, even when it came out. It definitely had a lot more usage, I would say, at least back then, where warping was definitely relegated to the likes of guidance and, you know, the occasional whatever may exist. But now that we have a lot more warping mechanics and a lot of other units that can just provide free warping with no issue whatsoever, on top of all the skills and effects that have just been negating visible bonuses during combat, it hasn't exactly been the best time for a lot of these types of skills. It definitely took a much larger hit than it probably could have, but even back then we still had stuff like guidance, which is still really common anyway. It definitely feels like a novelty Ekko at this point, which I think is fine. I don't think it's particularly bad, but I don't think it's something that most units are ever really going to need by this point anyway, which is why I can't really say it aged all too well. And, you know, I mean, if you have one lying around, it couldn't hurt to throw around on any sort of support unit that could use it, but otherwise I can't say it's really that useful for the most part. And considering it's a year old, or I guess a bit older than a year, it doesn't really surprise me that it hasn't aged the best, because that's just what happens with skills like these anyway. It has use if you really do want to use it though. Now, Deathblow Ekko, on the other hand, I'm probably going to get flack for this, but I think it was always the most underrated Ekko skill that we ever had. It was very basic. It gave you 4 attack when you initiated combat, and that was about it. And I'm willing to die on the hill that Deathblow Ekko was always pretty good, but aged a lot more because we started getting more competitive Ekkos, including Times Pulse Ekko and Far Trace Ekko, which, to be fair, are still only relegated to certain unit types, so you can still use Deathblow on any sort of melee cav or flyer if you want them to do more damage in the player phase, but it's definitely become a lot more competitive, whereas before I would have said Deathblow Ekko for a long while was actually one of the best Ekkos we've had in the game. It sounds like a bit of a stretch when it's a really basic Ekko skill, but every nuke just likes having attack. There's no downside to having Deathblow on any sort of nuke, which is why I could never really find myself to hating the skill at all. In fact, I still would probably use it on a lot of characters, but that's more so under the assumption that I don't have a lot of the other stuff such as Far Trace or Times Pulse, and eventually when we get near Trace Ekko, which I think is definitely going to happen, then there's probably just not going to be enough room for it anymore. But as an Ekko skill, you could only go so wrong with extra attack during your player phase, which, I mean, I think that's still pretty decent, but I would say at this point it definitely falls into the category of you don't really have any better option, but it's still useful regardless. And with Fleeting Ekko being the last 2023 Ekko skill, I would say this one probably had the biggest downfall for an Ekko skill, given the sheer amount of damage reduction piercing we have in the game at this point. The Ekko skill itself gives like 2 speed in the player phase and 30% DR when initiating combat, which doesn't include brave hits, keep in mind. It could potentially help with speed checks a tiny bit, and the extra DR could be useful in some situations, but at this point, most definitely not, just because everything has a way of getting around it, even if it's just cutting it in half, and 15% under that circumstance is basically going to be doing nothing for anybody. And it really shouldn't be a shock when I say these 3 skills haven't exactly aged the best, considering they're almost a year old each respectively, but whereas Deathblow, I find it's just so applicable in any single player phase nuke, Fleeting Ekko was never really that applicable to as many nukes because not every nuke needed the speed or the damage reduction never really applied, or both. I think if it granted extra speed instead of just 2 in the player phase, it probably would have had an argument to be at least on the same level, but at least with Deathblow, you could get a minimum of 4 to 8 damage on the player phase, or even up to 16 depending on who it's being used on. But Fleeting Ekko definitely feels like it is very, very niche comparatively, and the units that could use it could probably use it pretty well, but it definitely feels a lot more niche now than it was when it first released. And I mean, of the 3, I would definitely say it's the worst one, but it probably doesn't say much considering how old they are. Meanwhile, the one that came after that is just Soaring Ekko, and for some reason it was that good, and it continues to remain one of the best ones in the game because, yeah, putting Soaring Guidance in your Ekko slot for some reason is a choice they decided to make. It has basically all the properties of Soaring Guidance, except it doesn't give out no follow-up and stats to any allies during combat, but I feel like the biggest appeal always came with the warping anyway. Not that the other effects weren't useful, but freeing up your C slot for what could easily be more supportive capabilities or something for your own personal combat, while having the Ekko skill occupy the warping itself, is so incredibly good that it has only gotten better since its release because we've gotten a lot of really good competitive C slots for any sort of flyer to use, which includes, but not limited to, Breath of Life, Crux, Rain Snap, Deadly Miasma. There's just a lot of stuff flyers can take advantage of, and they'll probably get even more stuff in the future, which is why the skill continues to be as good as it is. What more is there to say? It's just a really, really good Ekko skill. And then we get the Guard Ekko, and it probably aged about as well as a lot of the older ones, except I would say slightly worse. Guard Ekko, when it came out, was probably okay-ish just because it gave you DR and guard, but over the course of the entirety of the year, they've been printing a lot of units with null guard effects. They drop the tempo seal. We get even more piercing, just becoming way more active, and just a lot of ways of getting around the Ekko skill that ended up not really being that useful for the most part. I would say it's about on the same level as Deathblow because you could throw it on any sort of tank and it could still just provide something. I was initially going to have Deathblow higher, but I was told that would be sacrilege and that it would be the worst thing to do ever. So yeah, I'll not do that. I'll definitely not do that. Regardless, I do think it's aged incredibly poorly, and if I had to put it, it's probably just the defensive equivalent of Deathblow Ekko, so probably be on that same level at this point. Definitely not as good in my opinion, but it could still probably have the same level of use case regardless. And then we get into Mercy Wing Ekko, which released back in April, and I think this was one of the more interesting Ekkos that we got because it's just Wings of Mercy 3. And comparatively to Wings of Mercy 4, Wings of Mercy 4 is just a lot better, but having Wings of Mercy 3 in your Ekko slot means that you could free up your B slot for a lot of other stuff that could make the prospect of something like Aetherite's Offense Gale Force a lot easier, or just slapping it on any dancer is just really good overall. There's definitely arguments to be had about whether or not it should be ranked as high as it is currently because it really is predominantly useful only in Aetherite's offense, but the ceiling for it is relatively high, all things considered, and that running Wings of Mercy 4 is a lot better because of the 2 spaces, which I 100% agree with. But Wings of Mercy Ekko isn't the worst thing, I feel. It probably ended up getting slightly better just because of more B slots we ended up getting over the course of this year since its release, but I definitely think it's going to be one of those things where if you really highly value the skill for something like Aetherite's offense, and it's probably going to be one of the better ones, but if you want something that's just widely applicable, then it's probably not going to be good anywhere else, which I think in that case is probably fine where it is, but this definitely feels like it could go anywhere on the list, so you'll have to let me know what you think down below. We do have Fortress Ekko, and I think at least this one isn't nearly as debatable. It's just a really, really good Ekko skill. It has all the properties of Deathblow Ekko, so it's easily a billion S's in S tier or whatever, but it also has the benefit of being able to give you Canto after combat or any action, regardless of the distance. It has the Far Trace 4 upgrade built into it, which is really, really nice because one of the biggest issues when it came to Far Trace 3 is that you can move any amount of spaces, but if you used up all your movement, then you wouldn't get Canto regardless, which is why I think it just wasn't ever that amazing of a skill to begin with. But the new ones are definitely a lot better because you do get the minimum on top of true damage, and this one just has that, albeit a bit nerfed. Still, it works dual phase and it works with AoE, so the damage ceiling could also be higher in some cases. I think its general utility is just really, really good for the most part, and I can't say I have any problems with it, which is why I would put it on the same tier as Soaring Ekko, but the overall ceiling between the two, that one's a bit more debatable. After that, you had Null C Echo on the Sacred Stones banner, and I think this is one of the more debatable Echo skills because on one hand, having Null C Echo for any infantry that could use it is just incredibly useful in this scenario where there's fire sweep effects present. On the other hand, fire sweep effects right now are just not really that present. It's very much one of those Echo skills that feels like it's going to fluctuate depending on how common certain units are and what effects they have. So if we had a lot of meta relevant staff units that required the use of NCD Echo or just any sort of unit with sweep, then I think the Echo would end up being really, really good. But as it currently stands, we don't have a lot of units like that, so its usage is definitely a lot more lowered comparatively. But maybe that could also be due to the fact that Null C Echo exists. Who am I kidding? It was like, can't say for certain, but it's always going to have a home on any sort of infantry vantage unit because having one less weakness to go up against when vantaging is always a really good thing. It's probably fine where it is at the moment, but we do also have the last Echo skill that was ever released in Time Pulse Echo, and this could easily have the argument for being better or just above NCD Echo because it's a free pulse for a lot of infantry, and this is especially useful for the ones that don't have slang because now you could use stuff like Gust and Lagu's Friend coupled together without really running into the issues of Lagu's Friend not really working with it. Times Pulse Echo, I think, has a lot of applicability when it comes to just anything. You could use it for tanking stuff, you could use it for Gale Force, nuking. It's just a really, really nice Echo skill to have around, which I don't know if I'd ever put it on the same level as Far Trace Echo or Soaring, but it's pretty applicable for a lot of infantry. That being said, this isn't necessarily about the quality of the Echo, but I do have to mention it is literally just Times Pulse 4 with no downside. And while it's not going to affect my rating of it, I do think it's one of my least favorite Echo skills because of that. You can look at a lot of the other Echo skills that we did get, and if you were to compare them in a vacuum to their original skill slot, then they are weaker comparatively. Even stuff like Guard Echo, because it just doesn't have attack debuffs, I think it's still weaker in a vacuum. But the biggest thing is that you still had the ability to run it in your Echo slot, which meant that in a lot of ways it ended up being better because it wasn't competing with stuff such as B slots or C slots in some cases, right? But Times Pulse 4 just has nothing different about it beyond the fact that it is just an Echo skill, which kind of annoys me in a lot of ways because it always felt like these Echo skills, yeah, they could be better in a lot of cases, but they were still inherently weaker than their actual versions, which at least I could appreciate. But I don't know what they really would have done with Times Pulse Echo that wasn't just making it Times Pulse 3, which I think still would have been fine, but I can't say I'm the biggest fan of it. And a lot of people already talked about the jump between Fleeting Ekko and Soaring Ekko, but the fact that this has literally no differentiation between its C-slot variant is kind of worrying because they could end up doing a lot of other stuff like that in the future. But regardless, as an Echo skill, it's still pretty good, and I don't think it's really going to age all too much. But for a year out in Echo skills, these 9 are a pretty decent selection for the most part, and I think this is how I would rank all of them respectively. You may disagree with a lot of them, and I think that's fair because I think some of the placements can be a lot more debatable than others, but you'll have to let me know about that down below. Am I wrong? Am I wrong about all of it? Am I wrong about nothing? How much wrong am I? And what do you agree with and disagree with? And how much am I cannot speak, but I'm leaving it in the video. Make sure to, I don't know, like and subscribe. That'd be pretty cool. Wouldn't that be really cool? And, yeah, I'm gonna defend Deathblow. I think Deathblow Echo is still a pretty good skill. It only had 1 line attacks, therefore it was bad. The end.